Michelle Marsh, Ernie Anastas, Warner Wolf with sports, and Mr. G with weather. The first team. This is Channel 2 News at 6.
As a train rolled into Grand Central Station today, the clocks rolled back to another time in New York's varied past. Channel 2's Vic Miles reports on a very special Thanksgiving reunion.
The turn of the century, a swell time for some, but not for upwards of 150,000 kids. New York's children of the streets. No parents, homes, or food to eat. That was their situation till the New York Foundling Hospital and later the Children's Aid people began gathering them up with an idea that coined the phrase, farm them out, on what was called the Orphan train. Our street kids sent off by rails to Midwest farms where they worked hard and ate well. You know what? It worked back then.
They were wonderful people. I was adopted into the state of Nebraska, but have lived in the state of Minnesota for 55 years.
The program operated between 1864 and as late as 1929. Today, the once destitute, abandoned kids came home, back to the Apple for a Thanksgiving reunion, experience swapping, and a train ride upstate that brought back vague memories of that other time.
Remember anything about the train ride out there?
Very vaguely. I don't know what it is, but there's a little something that I remember, but I can't really explain it.
They were farmed out as infants. Now, of course, they range in age from the late 70s to, as one lady said, my age? Oh, my God. Imagine these folks as kids, taken off our streets, cleaned up, and shipped out to willing farmers in, say, the Dakotas. Here's how it was done.
The Keiths signed up, and he gave them a number. Then when he came back to the New York Foundling Hospital, they hung a number on me, and the Keiths lucked out and got me then, see?
I'm told Billy the Kid was an orphan from Brooklyn who took this train ride, much the same way as many of the folks here did.
You wonder how they could still have any feeling for New York. But they do.
I like New York. I think it's great.
And to all a happy Thanksgiving. Vic Miles, Channel 2 News.
From the newsroom, this is Channel 9 News with Rollin Smith, Lloyd Lindsay Young's weather, and Russ Salzberg on sports.
They are part of history. Orphaned or abandoned, they became participants in a daring experiment. More than 100 years ago, the Children's Aid Society started a program that became the forerunner of today's foster care system. Chris O'Donoghue has a touching story of triumph over tragedy.
Many of them are in their 80s now, coming back to New York by train for a Thanksgiving homecoming. But behind the smiles are memories of humble beginnings, when as children of 3 and 4 years old, these were among thousands of New York orphans. Homeless and starving, they were picked up off the streets and sent by orphan trains to farm families throughout the Midwest. Al Bankston, now 64, was only 3 years old when his train brought him and hundreds like him to Kansas.
A lot of them were crying, I believe.
Why?
Because they're probably sad, because they're going places they didn't know where they wind up.
61 years later, it still brings tears to your eyes.
Yeah, it still brings tears.
It was off a 1922 orphan train that an Iowa family chose Arch Smith, age 4 then, 73 now.
This gentleman invited me to sit on his lap, and I did, and he decided I'd go home with him, and that was the way it was. He took me out to their 27-acre farm near in the edge of this small town, and that's where I grew up.
Most of them as children were well treated, but not all. 71-year-old Alice Ayler was older than most orphan train children. In 1930, she was all of 10 years old.
Older girls at that time were used mostly for work or for other purposes. Lots of headaches in those days, you know.
But surprisingly free of bitterness, these survivors are gathered to celebrate their triumphs in life, some to seek out their roots. Regardless of their life experiences, all of these returned orphans feel the orphan trains were a good idea, even for today, when up to 40,000 children are still homeless in New York City, in foster care, gridlocked in the child welfare system.
The lesson for today's children, I think, is very similar. Children need families.
Chris O'Donoghue, Channel 9 News.
From NBC News, this is Today. with Frank Gumble, Deborah Norval, and Joe Garagiola.
As thousands of Americans gather to give thanks with their families today, a group of former orphans is gathering in New York City to celebrate the day with some old friends. Stan Bernard reports.
From the 1850s to 1929, about 150,000 orphaned and homeless children were swept off the streets of New York like so much dust, put on trains and dispatched to Middle America. In small towns, they were inspected and what was called placed out, with families, some of whom loved them and others who abused them. In the search for their past, some who survived and others who thrived have formed the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America and returned to where they began their odyssey, Grand Central Station and New York. At a welcoming dinner, Alan Bankston still remembers his childhood journey west to Kansas.
All I remember is being with a bunch of kids who crying and the velvet drapes, that's all. And stopping along the way and getting rid of some of the kids.
Lorraine Williams was adopted by a loving college professor and his wife, but she said the orphan train children had to be resilient.
An orphan is a survivor. There's an instinct in an orphan that you don't have in a child that grew up in a tranquil situation.
Lorraine Williams searched and found the unmarked grave of the natural mother she never knew.
Surely she deserved more than just an unmarked grave.
They have not come back to mourn, but to celebrate their lives. Stan Bernard, NBC News, New York.
From WNBC TV, this is News 4 New York at 6 with Chuck Scarborough, Pat Harper, Al Roker with the weather, and Len Berman Sports.
Well, finally tonight there was a reunion going on in New York for some people who have a special reason to give thanks. They were orphaned in the early years of this century and taken from the squalor and poverty of the city streets. They were put on so-called orphan trains and sent out west. And now the survivors are back home. Connie Collins has their story.
This is a story not easily told of children now old, of memories made new, of orphans from long ago, yet not so unlike today, from a time when society couldn't care for them all. Children born of poverty into illness and death, tens of thousands of them neglected, abused, orphaned.
I was removed from my parents' home because of scandalous neglect.
I was left in a basket in Gimbel's ladies' ready-to-wear department by someone who had dressed me nicely and well, but for some reason or other couldn't see keeping me.
These are the children of the orphan trains, little ones sent from the squalor of New York via trains to the sunshine of Midwestern cornfields. The Children's Aid Society believed this was a loving solution to an unsolvable dilemma, and for many, it was oh so true.
Very good home.
You had a good home in Iowa.
I had a good home. I had a brother, an older brother waiting there for me that was their own child, and this was Worley and Lillian Smith. My mother had been a school teacher for a period of time.
And she loved you?
Yes, she did.
Some of the orphans even grew up to become mayors of the city that had become their new home. Others, like Marguerite Thompson, are today simply thankful they survived. For in Nebraska, she found not a home filled with love, but a house to be cleaned.
And she started me right in, working, scrubbing floors.
When you were 5 years old?
Yes.
Did you ever feel loved at all?
No. No, I never was loved there. I lived there till I was 11.
And then?
And then she said, well, you lie and you steal so much. And all I ever stole was food because I was hungry.
This is a story not easily told of those who rode an orphan train, children now grown old, their memories made new by a return to their roots. A story perhaps better told not in words, but in pauses.
You could say I'm with my brothers and sisters. It's a piece of history that has been long neglected.
Connie Collins, News 4, Manhattan.
That's our news for this evening. Hope your Thanksgiving is terrific. See you at 11.
Good night.
Channel 11. This is the News at 10.
On our Channel 11 cover story tonight, the story of people who left New York City a long time ago and dreamed for years of coming back. They left as orphan children on a long, sad train. Now they are back to search for what's left of their families and their past. Ed Miller has the story of their special reunion in New York City this week.
New York, circa 1900. Immigrants come here in search of streets paved with gold. While some find it, many others face poverty and are forced to abandon their children simply because they cannot feed them.
They are called wayward waifs, street urchins, children who are homeless, hungry, and cold. More than 30,000 roaming the streets. Some keep their feet wrapped in newspapers to stay warm, others steal bread to survive. Along with cholera and typhoid, child abandonment becomes an epidemic. So the Children's Aid Society decides to pack them up and ship them off.
From 1854 to 1929, trains like this one carry over 100,000 orphans away from the slums of New York to the farms of the Midwest, where the children are placed in foster homes. The boys work the fields, the girls cook and clean.
Every child that came on the train was indentured.
Meaning what?
Meaning that we were just like the black people in the South. You were sent there. What were the black people indentured for? It wasn't because they loved them.
You were sent there to do work.
That's right.
Orphan Toni Wheeler was put on the train and sent to Omaha, Nebraska when she was only 2.
I am missing a brother or a sister. I can't find anything. I have hit roadblocks. I can't find out if my parents were married in Ireland and came over here.
How does that make you feel that you're missing a brother or sister? They're probably floating around somewhere.
I want it. I would love to find it. As a child, I pretended I had a brother.
This group of orphans meets periodically to discuss their past, but for this Thanksgiving, a once-in-a-lifetime reunion back to New York, to the city they left behind as children, back to New York, perhaps to shake loose some memory or to discover some secret shred from their past.
My mother apparently tried very hard to keep me. My father, according to the last report I heard, deserted her, which was too bad.
When you were an orphan, you always feel rejected. You always feel, how could my mother and my father do this to me? So even though you may go on and live successful lives, there's always that scar.
So on this holiday, which celebrates family and homecoming, dozens of these orphans, now in their 80s, search for the key which could unlock their past. They may never find it, but they refuse to give up without trying.
Well, as I say, every night I go to bed, I think, who am I, what am I? Every night I think of that.
I'm Ed Miller, Channel 11 News at 10.
Very bittersweet story.
Moving, indeed.
The faces are much older now, the train much newer. But for Alice Eiler, the chugging of train wheels takes her back to 1929.
That's my worst memory, is they're crying and screaming, choo-choo, don't go away. That was the worst part, separating. The separation was the worst.
Alice is one of 20 surviving orphans who returned with their families to the city they left so long ago. Soon they will be at Grand Central Terminal, and they will remember a different time. Beginning in the mid-1850s, the New York City streets were filled with tattered street urchins. Abandoned and orphaned children were starving and desperate. So the Children's Aid Society decided a home in the heartland was better than anything New York City had to offer. They loaded the orphans onto trains, and at each stop in the Midwest, farm families and townspeople would come to make their choices. Some children were lucky. Others were abused and forced to work like slaves.
Yes, I was more fortunate than a lot of the orphan train riders. Some of them have real sad stories. It makes me realize just how fortunate I was.
80-year-old Jean Sexton found love in Neosho, Missouri. And now the train that brought her and other orphans to their new home brings them back to an old one.
Elisa Streeter, Eyewitness News at noon.
This is not the first time these orphans have stepped onto a train. More than 60 years ago, many of these folks remember the orphan train chugging west, taking them on a journey of hope that often ended in isolation and loneliness. Alice Eiler looks out over the Hudson River, the way she did back in 1929, when everything she understood about life in the Capital District was shattered as her parents abandoned their 5 children and shipped them off to New York City.
Of course, they didn't tell us ahead of time. They didn't warn us. They brought us from Albany down to New York City.
Alice, known as Tutu to her younger brothers, can never forget what happened next.
That's my worst memory, is they're crying and screaming, Tutu, don't go away. That was the worst part, separating. The separation was the worst.
They were put all over the Midwest. Now Alice's younger brother, Alan, walks the long train ramp at Grand Central Terminal, a walk he took years before. Alan says he got everything he could want in his new home in Kansas, except the one thing he needed most, love. This weekend, the surviving orphan train riders will spend it together in New York City, and Alice will give quiet thanks for spending it with the brother who was ripped from her arms 60 years ago. Elisa Streeter, 10 Eyewitness News.